I am Bruce Alexander. I'm a registered surveyor, and I was chosen to go to the Antarctic in 1958-59 on the second wholly New Zealand Government sponsored Antarctic expedition to the Ross Sea. Anyway, I'd long wanted to get to the Antarctic, having just missed out to Guy and Warren when applying for the Trans-Antarctic expedition in 1953. I was in Tonga at the time, and my father sent me an advert calling for 2 surveyors to go to the Antarctic in the summer of 1958-59. Our contract in Tonga was expiring, so Bob Miller, leader of the Trans-Antarctic expedition, telegraphed that I was accepted, provided I could pass a medical test. The 12 expedition members comprised 3 surveyors, 3 geologists, and 6 mountaineering assistants. Larry Harrington was the leader. Brian Fitzgerald, surveyor, was deputy leader. Arnold Heine had all been on the previous summer expeditions to Cape Hallett. The 6 field assistants were all experienced mountaineers, being John Harrison, Wally Remains, Jim Wilson, Mike White, Arnold Heine. Some of them had been in the Himalayas with Ed Hillary. The expedition members were transported from Littleton in the USS Staten Island icebreaker, and we were to be landed at Wood Bay in Terranova Bay on the west side of McMurdo Sound, previously unexplored areas. We were to explore as far inland as possible and link the previous year's survey work at Cape Hallett with that of work done by the Trans-Antarctic expedition in the Dry Valley and Scott's expedition in 1914. Mawson had mapped quite a large area around Terranova Bay on his way to search for the South Magnetic Pole. As with all expeditions, there's a huge amount of preparation and planning. I do remember being in a store at Lower Hutt with Wally Remains packing food boxes. All food had been carefully calculated for protein, fat, carbohydrates, calories, weighed and sorted by Arnold before being packed into plywood ration boxes that were then coated with painted stripes. The contents of each box contained rations for 20 man days and weighed about 48 pounds. The main content was pemmican. In addition, there was the assembling of sledges, which had been imported from Norway. Everything was lashed together with rawhide strips, as this provided great flexibility. We were expected to be man-hauling these sledges with food, tents, fuel and survey gear for at least 8 weeks. We were issued with polar clothing, consisting of a string singlet, long woolen underwear, woolen tartan shirts, windproof trousers, and wind jackets. Other clothing was the envy of the Americans, and we had many offers of wanting to exchange items with them. Anyway, on the 25th of November, we departed on the USS Staten Island, an American icebreaker. She had a crew of about 250, and the average age was about 18. You will note the stern is equipped with a V cut in the stern so that a vessel could come in behind and push the ship forward. The bow is cut away so the ship can charge up onto the ice flow and break it up with its own weight. And if the ship gets stuck, fuel can be pumped from one side to the other to set up a rocking motion which helps free it from the ice. Life on the icebreaker was interesting. We were outside Littleton Heads. The ship, with its round bottom hull and very little keel, began to roll. We spent the first day at sea splicing ropes for sledge traces and slings, and there was a 30-degree roll either side of vertical, One of the crew said to me, "Oh boy, this ship would roll on wet grass." Now I knew that in rough weather you don't want to be up in the bow or down the stern. You want to be on the centre of gravity. And the centre of gravity of the Staten Island was down in the bowels where the laundry was. So I went down to the laundry and found a cupboard, and I braced myself against the wall and just sat in the cupboard. Not many of our party felt like eating, as meal times were a matter of timing and quickness between rolls. I remember seeing a sailor in the middle of his tray of food sliding from one side of the mess deck to the other as the ship lurched and rolled. Anything was not tied down just fell over. The weather got worse, and there was no cooking at all, and we were given sandwiches. That's all the galley could do. As we progressed from the roaring 40s to the furious 50s and the screaming 60s, conditions got worse. We were not allowed on deck, and for 3 days we turned and went with the wind, losing our position in doing so. According to the pendulum on the wardroom wall, the ship was rolling 53 degrees either side of vertical. We were told that if it got to 58, there was a chance it would roll over. On December the 1st, at latitude 60, a prize was offered by the captain for the first sea ice, and the ship was stopped while everyone went on deck. Conditions gradually improved as we picked up speed to 12 knots until we hit pack ice in the Ross Sea and got stuck for several days, and then drifted slowly northward about 30 miles while waiting to rendezvous with the USS Glacier off Coolman Island, about 50 miles away. During these delays we were able to go out on the ice. Dr. Sladen, an eminent geologist, was on board the USS Staten Island and asked for permission to fly to the rookery on Coolman Island. When they came back, they brought Adelie penguins and some emperor penguins and chicks with them. When they were later presented to the Melbourne Zoo on her return from the Antarctic, the emperor penguins were so tame that they followed Dr. Sladen down the gangplank when they disembarked. The glacier broke 2 of its propeller blades in the pack ice, shearing one off 6 inches from the shaft, and thus had to limp back to Wellington to get them replaced. This was to have a disastrous effect on our expedition plans, as the 2 ships were to cut a channel into the coast to land us. It was considered too risky for one ship on its own, as the ice was so thick we were unable to get within 30 miles of the coast, and this was beyond the safety range of the helicopters. Our expedition had to be abandoned. This created quite a dilemma for the Americans. What would they do with 12 New Zealanders on board a ship bound for Wilkes Station on the other side of the continent? There were urgent meetings with Larry and Captain Price Lewis of the Staten Island and the Commodore USS Glacier. It was decided to proceed to McMurdo, and we would go to Scott Base on the 15th of December, 29 days after leaving Littleton. We were transported to Scott Base. Now, Mike White, who met Captain Price Lewis a couple of years later, told Mike that it was the roughest trip that he'd ever been on. We pitched tents about 100 yards from Scott Base because the reception at Scott Base was not that welcoming, and we were struck by the morale of those who had wintered over, all wanting to get home. while we were regarded as summer tourists. What were we to do now? It was finally decided, with the help of American support, to do some useful mapping and geologising work from Scott Base. The Americans were most apologetic for not getting us to Wood Bay and promised all sorts of helicopter support instead. It was extremely fortunate that Larry and Brian Fitzgerald were aware of the existence of hundreds of trimetricon aerial photos flown by Americans along the Victoria Land coast, and I think most of these were taken in about 1955 and ahead of the dry valleys. However, none of these photos could be properly used for map preparation until identifiable points on the ground had been fixed accurately for position, so that the orientation and relationship of features one to the other could be accurately plotted from the photos. In other words, there was no scale to the photos, and we had to establish what the scale was. So I remember taking off in an Otter aircraft with a bundle of photos on my knee and peering out the window and trying to relate the photos to the land we were flying over. Once we'd seen a readily identifiable feature and we knew where we were going, it was a simple exercise to return to the spot by helicopter and carry out our position fixing. We did it the last of the 200-year traditional surveying methods. Those methods are completely gone. It just makes me cry to think of the effort. And then we'd work out where to observe a star and the blooming cloud had come over. We'd spend, it took days. It wasn't just a matter of getting out a telescope and looking at the stars. You had to calculate where the star was.
God, and having to carry all that stuff around as well. Well, that would have...
Well, that was another pain in the neck. On December the 22nd, it must have been 1958, Wally, Remains, Mike White and myself left McMurdo by helicopter for the right dry valley to a point we had previously identified in an aerial photo. Couldn't find it, so we measured a half-mile baseline and did an ex-meridian fix for position. It's latitude, longitude and azimuth or bearing. While on the ridge, we thought we saw the point we were looking for below. Oh, the helicopter came and picked us up and took us to the spot while we did a position fix and round of photos and bearings to various peaks we had already observed to. Then we flew to the mouth of the Taylor Dry Valley, where we found scallop-shaped shells in the sand at the stream. New Year's Eve saw us hauling about 450 pound. There was a steady 12-knot tailwind, so we rigged the 10th floor as a sail and made 11.2 miles before camping. New Year's Day, we camped near Cape Crozier, having completed 46 miles from Cape Mackay. We climbed the knoll at Cape Crozier, 1,175 feet. There was a cairn there, and I did a noon transit of the sun. I visited the Adare Penguin Rookery and climbed to a point between the two rookeries, about 1,300 feet. Took more shots and photos and built a cairn. Unable to get a sun sight but got a sighting to Mount Terror, 5th of January. Radio scared was Scott Base, learning of otter crash at Marble Point, killing 2 people. At 6,000 feet, Jim said, "Oh, these tents are a bit small. If you get in it, they're all right to sit in, but you can't scratch." Left camp at 9:45 and reached the summit of Mount Terror at 6 p.m. We sailed to Wellington on the Endeavour in 4 or 5 days. That was the return journey to New Zealand by sea, 4 or 5 days, and it took us 29 days to get there.
Tell me about finding Wilson's igloo.
Well, it was just a heap of rock and canvas and medicine bottles and penguin skins, and that was that. A terrible spot on a windy ridge, the windiest place in the Antarctic. But there we were. We built a rock cairn there and left some food, and then we went back in the A for Abel Snowcat. We went back to Scott Base.
So what do you think when you see it in the museum?
I get all nostalgic.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, I feel privileged to have ridden in it.